Retro.
Hi, this is Emily Swallow, the Armorer in The Mandalorian. You're listening to Dennis and Jay on Podcast Stardust. This is the way.
Welcome to Podcast Stardust. This is the fully armed and operational podcast dedicated to Star Wars news, reviews, and discussion. I'm Dennis Keithley.
And I'm Jay Krebs.
And we're starting another week with the next episode in our The Clone Wars rewatch series. But before we dive into that, Jay, I want to remind everybody what our social media contacts are.
Absolutely, Dennis. We are on Facebook and Instagram conveniently at Podcast Stardust.
All right. The dish is aligned. The signal is boosted to maximum output. Stealth is activated. The shield is down. And we are now broadcasting to the galaxy. So this will be just our discussion of Cat and Mouse, which is episode 16 from season 2 of the Clone Wars. Another classic episode. Jay, you want to go ahead and give us the summary, please?
Absolutely. Senator Bail Organa's relief mission to the planet Christophsis has come under separatist attack. Anakin Skywalker's attempt to break the separatist blockade around the planet meets stiff resistance. Then Obi-Wan Kenobi arrives with a new trick for Anakin to try, a stealth ship. Compounding already difficult matters, Admiral Yularen realizes that the separatist fleet is led by the devious Admiral Trench. Although Obi-Wan issues direct orders to deliver relief supplies to Senator Organa, Anakin uses the stealth technology of his new ship in a fancy maneuver to first defeat Admiral Trench.
Indeed. Okay, so this is an interesting episode because here we are, episode 16 from season 2, and the episode portrays events that happened before everything else in the Clone Wars, before the Clone War movie, before episode 1 of season 1, before the other Christophsis episodes that we've seen. This is the beginning of the Clone Wars tale at this point. What did you think about this episode overall, Jay?
Well, it's interesting. I'm glad that you brought that up because I know when I've been asked about what order to watch Clone Wars, that this is always the first one that comes up. And I used to have this whole printout of exactly what episodes to watch when in an order of the timeline as opposed to the release of them. And so as soon as this came up on the screen, I was like, oh, this is like the very first one like ever. And so it's so much fun to see and put yourself in that mindset of, okay, this is where Anakin was before he even had Ahsoka as a Padawan. So looking at it from that lens and just from the fact that it was at this point just Obi-Wan and Anakin, quote unquote, that they didn't have Ahsoka around as kind of this third component, was very interesting. And then, as I was watching it as well, I rewatched it with my son, Obi-Wan. And every time Bail and Anakin were on screen together, I was like, oh my gosh, just thinking about how Bail is eventually going to be raising his daughter. And then there's that one scene where even Bail says, help us, basically Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're our only hope. And I was like, oh my gosh. So there were so many fun callbacks to different kinds of things and things that were even in The Empire Strikes Back about the cloaking device and, a lot of different things. So it was a fun episode, great to revisit. And, we got to see Admiral Trench for the first time in this, and we get to see how he and Anakin eventually become very much at odds with each other. So this is setting that up for future encounters. So much fun to revisit. But what were your thoughts?
Hard to follow that up. That's a lot.
Sorry.
You touched on a lot of things that we'll be discussing over the course of the discussion here, but some of the things that occurred to me is that, again, this rewatch benefits from so much content that's come after it. And, you made a reference to Admiral Trench, for instance. He'll return to the Clone Wars a couple times here. And just when you think he's dead. He, like a bad nightmare, he returns.
Mhm.
And then you got the call outs to the other lines from like the original trilogy, and I'll specifically highlight some of them in a bit. But the other thing is like, yeah, you made reference to Bail Organa and Anakin, and I know we've been referencing this a lot lately, but it just goes to highlight how well Alexander Free did when he wrote Reign of the Empire, Mask of Fear.
Yes.
And, when he has Bail Organa on that crusade to find justice for the Jedi, when you take him by itself, you don't necessarily get how deeply he feels about that. But then you see this episode and you realize, he was on a relief mission to Christophsis. He was under attack, and Anakin and Obi-Wan went through all of this stuff to get him supplies. And so when he's talking about, partnerships with the Jedi and how they did so much good against the galaxy, he knows what he's talking about. This highlights
Mhm.
that. And so I think both this episode and that book are enhanced by being able to have read / watched them and semi close proximity to each other
Oh,
there,
yeah, absolutely.
especially, and even stuff like Andor, season 2 kind of helps enhance this as well. Just the idea of the things that Bale's been through, and then now when he's standing up in the Senate and looking for opposition, supporting Mon Mothma's opposition to the Empire and stuff like that. Well, we have an understanding why, and this really helps flesh everything out. So that's a continuity comment that I'd make.
No, I love that.
One of the things you touched on was the that line from Bail Organa, help us, General Kenobi, your only hope. They were sneaky about that, but they introduced a number of lines in here that were callback to original trilogy lines. There was that one, and then when Trench is antagonizing Anakin after he attacks with the stealth ship, and Trench makes a comment that's very similar to what Palpatine says to Luke in Return of the Jedi about your forces on the planet, or your friends on the planet, are lost. And it's like, okay, that one's kind of subtle. That was one, maybe a bit of a stretch. But then even the line when Anakin is talking about how Trench is surprised because normally a ship this small doesn't have a cloaking device. That callback to the Empire Strikes Back when Han, takes turns the Millennium Falcon and goes into attack position against the Star Destroyer, only to disappear. And the captain, I think it was Nita, says, they disappear from our scopes. He's like, that's impossible. Ship that small can't have a cloaking device. All these subtle
Mhm.
little nods to things that we heard from their trilogy really made it stand out. It kind of helped ground it in in the familiar. I'm not going to use the term ring theory because it doesn't carry the structure. This episode does not carry the structure of those films, so it doesn't exactly fit in there. But those callbacks were fun in that regard.
Oh, yeah, and the featurette does a really great job. Of course, Dave Filoni is always so excited about those
Mhm.
little details and how they came up with this stealth ship and the design for it, and that George Lucas wanted it to be smaller. And even Dave Filoni said to him, "But they don't normally like ships of that size don't normally have a cloaking device." So there's like a throwaway line that Anakin even says, where he says,
Yeah,
"Well, ordinarily ships this size don't have a cloaking device." And it's like, okay, the fabric of the universe is now intact,
yep.
which
The
is
nerds will
so
be
great.
satisfied.
Exactly. I mean, and it's those little details that are just perfect.
Yeah. So let's talk about the cloaking device, the stealth ship here. And so this is an IPV-2C stealth corvette. Thank you, Wikipedia. And the Wikipedia article on this episode and the ship kind of talks about how it was inspired by World War II type of scenarios where the submarines were prowling around on the ocean, and then they'd come up and torpedo warships and like that. And that feeling very much comes through with the way the crew, the clone crew, and the Jedi act aboard the ship. It's like everyone's talking about armed torpedo tubes 1 through 4. Well, if you ever watch any type of submarine movie, that's what they're always doing. Armed
Oh,
torpedo
yeah,
tube
that's
1, torpedo
true.
2, those type of things. And then you've got everyone checking off on their station what it is that they're doing, because you have to do things in order to keep the submarine from being detected by the sonar of any other ship. And you also got to be very methodical on this with this cloaking device so that you don't give yourself away and make yourself vulnerable. So I found that a lot of fun. I also just could not help but feel a Star Trek influence with this, mainly with the Klingons and their birds of prey that always had cloaking devices on them. Just the various rules about once you take down your shields, you have to wait for the power of them back up, and that was the undoing of Trench in this. Is that Anakin tricked him into lowering the shields and then firing torpedoes at them, only for him to cloak and then lead those same torpedoes right back to him before he could get his shields up. So,
Yeah.
fun little process of tracking the inspirations for this episode.
Oh, yeah, for sure, and I didn't even I'm sure, with you, you are the Star Trek expert, and I love Star Trek myself, but I would never have picked up on some of that kind of stuff, but now that you mention it, I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I could totally see where you're coming from on that."
Right. The other thing that's fun is that this is the only time we see this particular ship, and it's the only time we see a cloaked ship in Star Wars on screen. However, there was another cloak ship that came to mind, and that was the Carrion Spike, which was Grand Moff Tarkin's personal ship that debuted in James Luceno's novel Tarkin. In fact, it gets
Mm.
stolen from him, and then he recruits Darth Vader to help him get it back at one point. And then that same ship gets taken over by a First Order commander by the name of Terex and shows up frequently in the Poe Dameron comic series that came out in 2016, I want to say, after The Force Awakens was in theaters. So you can find more of this type of action if you're interested. Go check out both Tarkin and Poe Dameron if you're so inclined.
Love that. There's so many different types of things that are in the Clone Wars that we never see again,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But I mean, it's fun that they make use of a lot of those things, and I'm so glad that you brought up those references and, so that our listeners and myself included kind of know how they're all tied together. But I mean, I guess it's not surprising that the Republic would have come up with this, which eventually becomes the Empire, which eventually creates the Death Star. So, there is that evolution.
Right, right. Well, and the other thing that's, I think, even though this is not chronologically correct, here we are, episode 16 from season 2. I think it was a good idea to save this episode for when they did, as opposed to putting it at the beginning of the series, because the idea of a cloaking device, yeah, I got to reference The Empire Strikes Back, but it's not something we're used to in Star Wars here, and so I think that once we're familiar with the characters, we're familiar with the setting and everything else, this is something that they could introduce, but it might have come under like heavy criticism if they had started with this. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
No, I believe that it does, and it's almost we've done so many different throwback kinds of things before where, I mean, just Star Wars in general is a, original prequel sequel kind of thing. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's
Right.
fine.
Well, let's turn to Admiral Trench. So he debuts in this episode, and he is the giant tarantula-inspired alien. I mean, he's got 2 legs, 6 arms, so and his head looks just like a tarantula's with all the extra eyes and the mandibles that click. I love that clicking that they do with the way he
Mhm.
talks and talks. Voiced by D. Bradley Baker, demonstrating his range. He does more than clones, folks. The species is called a harch, and here's the thing. It's like I was thinking about this, Jay, after I watched the episode, and we know he returns, and he's at least mentioned in other episodes, and then he ultimately meets his fate in what, season 7 of the Clone Wars, Final
Mhm.
Fate. But this is like almost a General Grievous level type of a villain. They just never flesh out everything that he does in the Clone Wars. But if you sit back and you think about his reputation, because Admiral Yularen is the one that recognized the tactics and then went back and viewed the battle footage from when Anakin tried to take out this blockade, and then noticed the emblem, Trench's emblem on the ship, and put 2 and 2 together and figured out who this guy was. So he's got a reputation. It's almost too bad that they didn't do more with Trench here, because that could have been another character that was on Grievous's level that could have gone up against the Jedi and taken some losses that Grievous otherwise wouldn't necessarily had to take, that kind of diminish how dangerous we think Grievous is, if you know what I'm
Mhm.
saying.
No, I totally do. Yeah, and I mean, as far as Trench goes, his reputation, as you said, definitely precedes him, and he literally wears that on his sleeve and
Mhm.
his, coat. He's dressed as your, basic traditional type general, I guess you could say, and
Mhm.
he's sporting all of his medals and all of the things. And just the fact that Yularen, as soon as he sees that emblem that he recognizes as Trench's, you know that it strikes a little bit of, I don't want to say fear, but he knows what Trench is capable of. Which of course Anakin's just like, yeah, whatever, it's just another day kind of thing. But Yularen's like, no, this is someone we need to take very seriously.
Yeah. And I'm surprised this has not already been developed into a book or a comic or something, but Admiral Yularen talks about the Battle of Malastare Narrows, which is where he encountered Trench the first time. And he talks about how many losses that Trench inflicted on the Republic fleet that was there, and that, there was it was believed that Trench was ultimately killed in the battle, only for him to come back here. This is not the first time that Trench will be believed to be dead, and he'll come back later. Spoiler.
Right.
But how this has not been turned into a comic, just a one shot, a mini series or something like that, or a book already is beyond me, because it felt like they set it up exactly for that. Obviously it couldn't feature Anakin, and Obi-Wan wasn't there because he doesn't know anything about Trench, but you could put some other Jedi in there if you wanted to. I mean, it could even be, Plo Koon, Mace Windu, or somebody like that. But this is just begging for, that's what they do with Legends. They take these little references and they turn them into something.
Right. Yeah. Maybe, hopefully, somebody's listening to this right now because you're absolutely right. That would be super cool. And I mean, it's obvious that Yularen, when he took that pause, and he says that he lost many of the men that he cared about. I mean, right there, as you said, is just the open door to be
Mhm.
able to explore that even further. Yeah, it's definitely a missed opportunity.
Yeah. So when Obi-Wan shows up with the stealth ship, he gives it to Anakin, and Anakin is supposed to use it to deliver the relief supplies to Bail Organa and the people on Christophsis. And it's not until they actually got into space with this that Anakin realizes that he has an opportunity to take out Trench with this. And so he deliberately disobeys Obi-Wan in this regard. And Obi-Wan tells him, you're disobeying orders. That's not what your mission is supposed to be. But Obi-Wan lets him get away with this. What'd you make of all that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is just the dynamic that the two of them have had, that Obi-Wan is the master rolling his eyes at Anakin, and Anakin is the young, impetuous knight that kind of takes things into his own hands. And, the fact that Anakin is the chosen one after all, I think Obi-Wan gives Anakin a lot of free passes because of that. But I mean, it's just that same dynamic. But yet, then again, this is a very serious situation. And, and Anakin just kind of playing it off like, oh yeah, yeah, whatever. Just like always.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is Anakin knows how to talk to Obi-Wan about this stuff. And one, it's like he tells Obi-Wan what he's going to do, and before Obi-Wan can lecture him too much, he like disconnects. He turns off the comm, and
Yeah.
then he goes about it almost under the theory it's like it's better to ask for forgiveness later than it is for permission, because he also has got such confidence. I mean, Anakin's got a pretty good big ego that he's gonna be able to
Oh
pull this
yeah.
off. So there is that, and then he ultimately is successful in that regard. But I it's the thing that gets me is that look, it's Obi-Wan will go on to tell us in Revenge of the Sith when he's standing over Anakin, who's been burnt or crisp on the shores of Mustafar. It's like, you're my brother. I love you. You're supposed to be the chosen one. And then in Attack of the Clones, he sticks up for Anakin to Mace and Yoda. Is he not the chosen one? He's never let me down. Those type of comments here. He knows what Anakin is capable of, but and again, Anakin is responsible for his own choices. And so I blathered on, but my point is like, I'm not sure Obi-Wan's necessarily done Anakin any favors by not holding him to account for things like this, which is
Mhm.
great. You blew up Trench and we were able to get the supplies across, but you could have got the supplies across without blowing up Trench and then come blowing them up later. I gave you an order. You're supposed to follow the order. You didn't have
Right.
to do it right then in that moment.
Right. And I think a lot of that is just, kind of looking into the reality of the plot point and setting up, again, this dynamic that follows them throughout the Clone Wars. And it's just Anakin being Anakin, being very impetuous. He has this new toy. he has
Yeah.
to try it out kind of thing, but all that does is antagonizes Trench even further.
Right. But the other thing is that now I'm thinking about, again, this is the very first thing from the Clone Wars. Well, then think of the malevolence. And
Mhm.
when Obi-Wan sends Anakin and Ahsoka out there to, they're looking for the malevolence, but they turned into a rescue mission. And then later, when he's supposed to be doing another mission, and he goes after R2,
Right.
and now we've actually got some context for why Obi-Wan could get so frustrated with Anakin back in
Good
season one
point.
when he was doing all these things.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. But yeah, that battle of between Anakin and Trench there, tell me what you think about all that.
Oh, that was so good. I mean, just Anakin knowing what Trench was looking for
Hmm.
with the, what was it? The signature, metallic not metallic signature,
Magnetic.
magnetic
Hmm.
signatures. And just knowing that, I mean, Anakin's always been such a great statistician with stuff. He just intrinsically understands how things work. And that goes all the way back from, him being in on Tatooine and building all of these things and how close they came
Yeah.
in just grazing the top of his ship so that it would throw off that magnetic signature and actually run into Trench. That was brilliant. I loved that.
Yeah. No, that was really cool. I mean, even the predecessor to the fight, when they're cloaked and they get past the blockade itself, and Trench is sitting there on his little throne inside his ship, which I believe is called the Invincible, and proves not to be the case. But he says,
Indeed.
something odd is happening because Obi-Wan has not moved to attack yet. And he's trying to goad Obi-Wan and the Republic and the clones into attacking so he can destroy them. So he sends the hyena bombers down to Christophsis to attack Bail Organa's position. And at first, Anakin and Yularen and the clones don't on the stealth ship don't understand what's going on, and so they think that he's coming right for them, and then they go right past. Again, another neat little submarine moment, right? I mean, they just go on past without even noticing it there because it's running in silent mode there. But then it's like, okay, this works, and that just gives Anakin more confidence. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
well, if they can't see us, I can sneak up behind them. And so it brings me, I kind of want to not abandon this discussion but get into another point. Yularen was such an alarmist in this episode. I mean, kudos to him for figuring out what was Trench, but then he volunteers to be a consultant for Anakin on this cloak ship, and he just like nearly panics like two or three times on this. It's like, they're coming right for us. It's too late.
Mhm.
Constantly. And I'm like, you're supposed to be an admiral. Aren't you supposed to be a little bit cooler under fire than this, dude? What's going on?
No, I can totally see where you're coming from on that, and I think that Trench had him so rattled that his, overly careful approach in this situation really does stem from those real wartime experiences, but to your point, as you said, that's his job. He's supposed
Mhm.
to be able to, deal with those kinds of things and go beyond fears and not amplify or overreact threats beyond reason. You know what I mean? So, yeah, so it's kind of a really weird sort of portrayal for Yularen in this case, for sure.
Yeah. And if you contrast this with the episode from the Ryloth arc in season one, when they're trying to liberate Ryloth and they have to get past that blockade. And he's very sure of himself. He's very about following orders. He's very about doing things by the book. And he's very confident. And even when the his ship comes under fire, he's so much more together under it. So maybe Trench is the difference. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of it that way. That if it
Yeah.
hadn't been anybody else there, maybe he would not have been so worked up about it. But I just
Mhm.
kind of, I was like, are you here to make Anakin just look that much better, or what's the situation? Because it's an interesting foil. He didn't inspire me. I can't imagine he inspired anyone on that ship, any of the clones. But uh,
Mhm.
anyway,
Yeah.
okay. Well, we've got everything that I noted to talk about this episode. Is there anything else you want to bring up before we wrap it up?
Okay, so leave it to me to pick out details about different types of costumes and whatnot, but
Okay.
these particular clone troopers, they had, like, for lack of a better term, earmuffs that, and I'm thinking of Spark specifically, that's one of the
Yeah,
names of the clone
the
troopers
rookie.
that comes to mind. Yeah, and so I was thinking to myself, "Okay, I'm not really familiar with this type of clone trooper, and I don't really, at least I've never paid attention to seeing, even at cons and things, people being, dressed up in cosplay as this type of trooper. Do you know what type of trooper this is?"
No, that's a good point. I don't recall seeing them anywhere else. That doesn't mean that they haven't, but I got the feeling that these clone troopers were trained to do this exact to run a ship as opposed to being commandos and the like. I'm
Mhm,
sure they can handle them a gun, and they're wearing armor, and so they can participate in combat just fine. But I took it to be that we'll see clones on the bridge of ships, but they're wearing uniforms as opposed to armor. These guys, I got the impression that they were much more of the pilots, the con operators, that type of thing, not
mhm,
necessarily officer type. But
mhm.
yeah, that's a good point on the armor. That was definitely different.
Yeah, so I wonder if they're called stealth troopers because they were specific to this particular mission, but they reminded me of Princess Leia's buns. Like like, I was like, "Oh, these are, like, maybe, like, Leia troopers, who knows?" But it'd
Not
be
quite the
perfect if
cinnamon
they were.
rolls, but yeah, not the sticky buns, but
Oh,
close
that's
enough.
too funny. But yeah,
Yeah.
so anyways, that's just one thing that stood out to me.
Okay. All right.
Fun.
Okay, well, then I think that's a good a place as any to go ahead and wrap up this episode. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion of the Clone Wars here on Podcast Stardust. We hope you've enjoyed it. And right now, we are covering Clone Wars on Monday. We'll be doing so for the next few weeks, but then when the new Visions series debuts, and also, when we get into the Lego Rebuild the Galaxy pieces of the past, we may be taking a little bit hiatus to cover those things. But again, typically on Mondays, we're covering Clone Wars right now until we get through all 7 seasons. So if you want to catch those recaps as we go through our rewatch, then make sure you subscribe to the podcast on your podcast of choice. We can be found on just about every platform. And if we're not there, let me know, and I'll see what I have to do to get the show on your catcher of choice. But other place you can find the show is retrozap.com. We've been there since the beginning, back in 2019. There's a lot of other great podcasts over there right now. Shows that are got some current content include Enjoy Stuff, Love, Death, and Robots Plus. I know Superhero Suite just put out an episode as well, so make sure you go check those out. Jay, you remind everybody what the social media contacts are one more time, and a few other places we can be found online.
Absolutely. So we are most easily found on all your socials, including Facebook and Instagram at Podcast Stardust. And so if you are a fan of Clone Wars, especially this episode, we'd love to hear your reactions. And you can also do that on our two YouTube outlets. So we have the traditional YouTube as well as YouTube Music. So you can leave comments over there, interact with us, and we'd love it if you would please subscribe and share those out with your friends as well. And we also maintain some Pinterest boards. And so you can check out all kinds of things for everything Star Wars. So if you need some creative designs for everything from party planning to nail designs, you can check that out over on Pinterest. And then if you are up for some new Podcast Stardust swag or tote bags or even some home goods, you can head over to our TeePublic store. And the link to that will be in our show notes. And there are 7 different show logo designs to pick from. And if you do happen to pick something up, please know that all of those sales do help to support the show. So we appreciate it and thanks in advance.
Okay, upcoming on the show on Wednesday, we have our monthly feature known as World Between Worlds, where Jay has rounded up Star Wars lifestyle and fashion products to share with us. And then Friday, as we usually do, we are wrapping up the week with some recent Star Wars news. That's been hit or miss lately, so if there's no news, we'll find something else fun to talk about. But stick around, find out what we do. With that having been said, thanks for listening to episode 927 of Podcast Stars, everyone. Have a great week, and until next time, may the Force be with you.